Question 1. Regulatory review indicates that a recent People Answers assessment for a candidate identified a specific area of potential weakness in their communication style. The hiring manager is considering whether to proceed with the candidate's offer of employment. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Share the specific assessment score with the candidate and require them to undergo additional, unvalidated training before an offer can be considered. Option B. Proceed with the offer of employment without any further consideration of the assessment findings, assuming the candidate will adapt naturally. Option C. Immediately withdraw the offer of employment, as the assessment clearly indicates the candidate is not a suitable fit for the role. Option D. Discuss the assessment findings with the candidate, explore their self-awareness of this area, and consider how support and development could be provided to mitigate any potential impact on their role. The correct answer is D. Discuss the assessment findings with the candidate, explore their self-awareness of this area, and consider how support and development could be provided to mitigate any potential impact on their role. Explanation. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge within the People Answers assessment framework, specifically concerning the interpretation and application of assessment results in a practical employment context. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for objective assessment with the nuanced realities of individual performance and potential, while strictly adhering to the People Answers assessment's guidelines and the underlying regulatory framework that governs fair employment practices. It requires careful judgment to avoid bias and ensure that assessment outcomes are used constructively and ethically. The correct approach involves a holistic review of the assessment results, considering them as one data point among many. This aligns with best professional practice by acknowledging that no single assessment is perfectly predictive of future job performance. It emphasizes using the assessment to identify areas for development and support, rather than as a definitive judgment of an individual's suitability or potential. This approach is ethically sound and compliant with regulations that mandate fair and non-discriminatory employment decisions, as it promotes a developmental perspective and avoids premature conclusions based solely on assessment scores. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the assessment score to make a definitive decision about an individual's future, such as immediate termination or denial of a promotion, without further context or consideration. This fails to acknowledge the limitations of any assessment tool and can lead to unfair outcomes. Such an approach could violate ethical principles of fairness and respect for individuals, and potentially contravene employment laws that protect against arbitrary dismissal or discrimination. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the assessment results entirely, as this would disregard a potentially valuable tool for identifying development needs and could lead to missed opportunities for employee growth and improved team performance. This would be a failure to implement the People Answers assessment effectively and could be seen as a dereliction of professional duty to utilize available resources for employee development and organizational improvement. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the purpose and limitations of the People Answers assessment. They should then gather all relevant information, including the assessment results, performance reviews, observed behaviors, and any other pertinent data. The assessment results should be interpreted in context, focusing on insights for development and support. Decisions should be made collaboratively where appropriate, with a clear rationale that is communicated transparently and ethically, ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations and internal policies. Question 2. Cost-benefit analysis shows that adopting a new cloud-based client management system will significantly reduce operational expenses. However, the vendor's data security protocols are less stringent than the firm's current on-premise system, and there is limited information available regarding their data breach response plan. The firm's compliance officer is concerned about potential data privacy risks and the implications for client confidentiality under the People Answers assessment framework. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Proceed with the adoption of the new system, prioritizing the immediate cost savings, and address any potential data security issues reactively if they arise. Option B. Negotiate with the vendor to implement a hybrid solution where sensitive client data remains on the firm's existing on-premise system, while less sensitive information is migrated to the cloud. Option C. Implement the new system but inform clients that their data will be stored on a cloud platform with potentially less robust security, allowing them to opt out if they are concerned. Option D. Delay the adoption of the new system until the vendor can provide comprehensive documentation and assurances regarding their data security and breach response capabilities, even if this means foregoing the immediate cost savings. Correct answer is A. Proceed with the adoption of the new system, prioritizing the immediate cost savings, and address any potential data security issues reactively if they arise. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial benefits of a new technology against the potential, albeit less quantifiable, risks to client data privacy and security. The firm is under pressure to adopt cost-saving measures, but the People Answers Assessment Framework emphasizes a fiduciary duty to clients, which includes safeguarding their information. The challenge lies in making a decision that is not solely driven by short-term financial gains, but also upholds long-term client trust and regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, risk-based assessment of the new technology's impact on client data privacy and security, aligning with the core principles of the People Answers Assessment. This involves a detailed review of the vendor's security protocols, data handling practices, and compliance with relevant data protection regulations. It also necessitates clear communication with clients about any changes that might affect their data, offering them informed choices where appropriate. This proactive and client-centric approach demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence, mitigating potential breaches and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the cost savings, without adequately assessing data security risks, fails to meet the fiduciary duty owed to clients. This oversight can lead to regulatory breaches, such as violations of data protection laws, resulting in significant fines and legal repercussions. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for client confidentiality and trust, which are paramount in the financial services industry. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing the technology without informing clients about the potential data implications is also professionally unacceptable. This lack of transparency violates ethical principles of honesty and client autonomy. Clients have a right to understand how their data is being handled, and withholding this information erodes trust and can lead to client dissatisfaction and potential complaints to regulatory bodies. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This includes identifying potential risks, evaluating their likelihood and impact, and developing mitigation strategies. It also requires consulting relevant internal policies, regulatory guidance, and legal counsel. Crucially, it mandates open and honest communication with stakeholders, particularly clients, ensuring that decisions are made with full awareness of all implications and in alignment with ethical and regulatory obligations. Question 3. System analysis indicates a financial advisor has received credible information from a client that the client intends to use illicitly obtained funds to engage in a transaction that could facilitate significant financial crime. The client has explicitly requested that this information remain confidential. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Maintain strict client confidentiality and do not disclose any information, as the client has requested it be kept private. Option B. Advise the client that their intended actions could have legal repercussions and hope they reconsider their plans. Option C. Disclose all information about the client and their intended transaction to the relevant authorities immediately without further assessment. Option D. Report the potential financial crime to the relevant authorities, while seeking to minimize the disclosure of unnecessary client-specific details beyond what is required to report the suspected activity. The correct answer is D. Report the potential financial crime to the relevant authorities, while seeking to minimize the disclosure of unnecessary client-specific details beyond what is required to report the suspected activity. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's obligation to maintain client confidentiality and the potential need to disclose information that could prevent harm. The core of the dilemma lies in balancing these competing ethical and regulatory duties. A professional must exercise careful judgment to determine when the duty to protect client information can be overridden by a higher obligation. The correct approach prioritizes the prevention of serious harm, while adhering to the spirit of regulatory frameworks that often allow for disclosure in such extreme circumstances. This approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and public safety, aligning with principles of responsible professional behavior. It acknowledges that while confidentiality is paramount, it is not absolute when faced with credible threats of significant harm. Regulatory guidelines, even if not explicitly detailed here, typically provide a framework for such exceptional disclosures, emphasizing proportionality and necessity. Incorrect approaches fail to adequately address the severity of the potential harm or misinterpret the boundaries of confidentiality. One incorrect approach might involve a rigid adherence to confidentiality, ignoring the credible threat of harm. This would be a regulatory and ethical failure, as it prioritizes a rule over the prevention of foreseeable and significant damage, potentially violating broader ethical duties of care and societal responsibility. Another incorrect approach could be an overreaction, disclosing information without sufficient certainty or basis, which would breach client confidentiality without a justifiable reason and potentially violate data protection regulations. A third incorrect approach might be to delay action, hoping the situation resolves itself, which is a failure of due diligence and proactive risk management, potentially leading to greater harm and regulatory scrutiny for inaction. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves 1. Assessing the credibility and severity of the potential harm. 2. Reviewing relevant regulatory obligations and ethical codes regarding confidentiality and disclosure. 3. Consulting with supervisors or legal counsel if uncertainty exists. And 4. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale for any action taken. This structured approach ensures that decisions are well considered, defensible, and aligned with professional standards. Question 4. Compliance review shows an employee has been accused of a minor breach of internal policy by a colleague. The accusation is currently unsubstantiated and lacks concrete evidence. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the compliance officer? Option A. Discuss the allegations informally with the employee to gauge their reaction. Option B. Issue a formal warning to the employee based on the colleague's report. Option C. Disregard the report as it is unsubstantiated and appears minor. Option D. Initiate a formal, documented investigation into the alleged policy breach. Correct answer is D. Initiate a formal, documented investigation into the alleged policy breach. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it pits the immediate need to address a potential compliance breach against the established procedures and the potential for reputational damage if handled improperly. The compliance officer must balance the urgency of the situation with the need for thoroughness and fairness, ensuring that any action taken is both legally sound and ethically justifiable. The pressure to act quickly without sufficient evidence or due process can lead to significant errors. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves initiating a formal, documented investigation. This aligns with principles of due process and regulatory best practices, which mandate that allegations be investigated thoroughly and impartially before any disciplinary action is taken. This approach ensures that all relevant facts are gathered, evidence is properly assessed, and a fair decision can be made based on objective findings. It also provides a clear audit trail, which is crucial for demonstrating compliance with internal policies and external regulations. This method upholds the integrity of the compliance function and protects the firm from potential legal challenges. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately issue a formal warning based solely on the initial report. This fails to acknowledge the presumption of innocence and bypasses the necessary investigative steps. It represents a failure to adhere to due process and could lead to unjustified disciplinary action, potentially violating employment law and ethical standards. Such an action could also damage the employee's reputation and morale without proper cause. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the report due to the perceived minor nature of the alleged infraction. This is a failure of the compliance function's duty to investigate all reported concerns, regardless of initial perceived severity. It could allow a minor issue to escalate into a more significant compliance breach or a pattern of misconduct, exposing the firm to regulatory penalties and reputational damage. It also signals a lack of commitment to a strong compliance culture. A third incorrect approach is to discuss the allegations informally with the employee without initiating a formal process. While seemingly less confrontational, This lacks the structure and documentation required for a proper investigation. It can lead to misunderstandings, incomplete information gathering, and an inability to demonstrate that the matter was handled appropriately if it later escalates. It also fails to create a record that can be used for future reference or regulatory scrutiny. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should follow a structured decision-making process. First, acknowledge and document the report. Second, assess the initial information to determine the appropriate level of investigation required, adhering to established internal policies and regulatory guidelines. Third, initiate a formal, impartial investigation, ensuring all parties have an opportunity to be heard and all relevant evidence is collected. Fourth, base any subsequent actions on the findings of the investigation. Finally, document all steps taken and decisions made throughout the process. This systematic approach ensures fairness, compliance, and robust risk management. Question 5. Governance review demonstrates that a significant volume of client data, collected for regulatory reporting purposes, is currently underutilized. A proposal is made to leverage this data for targeted marketing campaigns to identify potential cross-selling opportunities, thereby increasing revenue. However, the data has not been explicitly consented to for marketing purposes, and the proposed anonymization methods are considered basic by the review team. What is the most ethically and regulatorily sound approach to address this situation? Option A. Obtain explicit, informed consent from clients for the use of their data in marketing campaigns, ensuring robust anonymization and data security protocols are implemented before any utilization. Option B. Proceed with using the data for marketing, as the anonymization methods are sufficient to prevent individual identification, and the potential revenue increase benefits the firm and indirectly its clients. Option C. Share the data with the marketing department immediately, instructing them to use it cautiously and to avoid direct client contact based on the specific data points. Option D. Disregard the governance review's findings regarding data underutilization and continue to use the data solely for its original regulatory reporting purpose to avoid any potential compliance issues. The correct answer is A. Obtain explicit, informed consent from clients for the use of their data in marketing campaigns, ensuring robust anonymization and data security protocols are implemented before any utilization. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it pits the immediate need for operational efficiency and cost reduction against the fundamental ethical obligation to maintain client confidentiality and data integrity. The temptation to leverage readily available, albeit potentially compromised, data for a perceived business advantage creates a conflict between short-term gains and long-term trust and regulatory compliance. The pressure to deliver results quickly can obscure the potential downstream consequences of unethical data handling. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes client confidentiality and data security above all else. This aligns with the core principles of professional conduct and regulatory frameworks that mandate the protection of sensitive client information. By seeking explicit, informed consent and ensuring robust data anonymization and security protocols are in place before any data is utilized, the professional upholds their fiduciary duty and adheres to the spirit and letter of regulations designed to prevent data misuse and breaches. This demonstrates best professional practice by proactively mitigating risks and maintaining client trust, which is paramount in the financial services industry. Incorrect approaches analysis. Utilizing the data without explicit consent, even if anonymized, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It breaches the fundamental principle of client confidentiality and potentially violates data protection laws that require consent for data processing, even for internal analysis. This approach prioritizes expediency over ethical obligations and could lead to severe reputational damage and legal repercussions. Sharing the data with the marketing department without a clear understanding of their intended use and without implementing stringent data governance controls is another failure. This creates an uncontrolled environment where sensitive information could be inadvertently exposed or misused, further violating confidentiality and data security principles. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to establish appropriate internal controls. Ignoring the governance review's findings and proceeding with the data utilization without addressing the identified risks is a direct contravention of professional responsibility and good governance. It signifies a disregard for established policies and a failure to act with integrity, potentially exposing the firm and its clients to unacceptable risks. This approach undermines the entire purpose of governance reviews and demonstrates a lack of accountability. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must identify the ethical and regulatory principles at play, such as confidentiality, data protection, and integrity. Second, they should assess the potential risks and consequences of each possible course of action, considering both immediate and long-term impacts. Third, they should consult relevant policies, procedures, and legal counsel if necessary. Finally, they must choose the option that best upholds their professional obligations, prioritizes client interests, and ensures compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, even if it requires more time or resources. Question 6. Market research demonstrates that a significant client, a burgeoning fintech company, is planning a new marketing campaign for a novel investment product. The campaign materials, while not overtly false, use highly optimistic language and omit crucial details about the product's inherent volatility and the potential for significant capital loss, aiming to attract a broad retail investor base. The firm's compliance department has flagged these materials as potentially misleading under current regulations governing financial promotions. The professional responsible for the client relationship is under pressure to approve the campaign to retain the client's substantial business. What is the most appropriate course of action for the professional? Option A. Inform the client that the firm cannot proceed with the campaign as presented and immediately terminate the relationship due to the perceived ethical conflict. Option B. Advise the client that the proposed marketing materials are likely to contravene regulatory requirements for financial promotions and explain the specific concerns, proposing alternative wording or a revised approach that accurately reflects the product's risks while still being appealing. Option C. Proceed with approving the marketing campaign as requested by the client to maintain the business relationship, assuming the client will eventually rectify any issues if they arise. Option D. Approve the marketing campaign with a brief, informal note to the client suggesting they be mindful of regulatory nuances without detailing specific concerns. The correct answer is B. Advise the client that the proposed marketing materials are likely to contravene regulatory requirements for financial promotions and explain the specific concerns, proposing alternative wording or a revised approach that accurately reflects the product's risks while still being appealing. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to maintain client relationships and the regulatory obligation to act in the best interests of clients and uphold market integrity. The pressure to retain a significant client, especially when their proposed actions, while not explicitly illegal, could be perceived as misleading or manipulative, creates an ethical tightrope. Careful judgment is required to balance commercial interests with fiduciary duties and regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes client welfare and regulatory adherence over short-term commercial gain. By clearly articulating the potential negative consequences and regulatory implications of the client's proposed marketing strategy, the professional demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and client protection. This aligns with the principles of acting with integrity, due skill, care, and diligence, and maintaining client confidentiality, while also upholding the reputation of the financial services industry. Specifically, it addresses the duty to avoid misleading communications and to ensure that advice given is suitable and in the client's best interest, as mandated by regulatory frameworks governing financial promotions and client advisory services. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the marketing campaign without further discussion or qualification would be professionally unacceptable. This would constitute a failure to act with due skill, care, and diligence, as it ignores potential harm to consumers and the firm's regulatory standing. Could also be seen as facilitating misleading advertising, a direct contravention of regulations designed to protect investors. Another incorrect approach, such as agreeing to the campaign with only a cursory mention of potential issues, fails to adequately discharge the professional's duty of care. It suggests a lack of conviction in advising the client against a potentially harmful course of action, thereby not fully protecting the client or the market. A third incorrect approach, which is to immediately refuse to work with the client without exploring alternatives or explaining the reasoning, while perhaps stemming from a desire to avoid complicity, could be seen as unprofessional and lacking in client relationship management, potentially damaging the firm's reputation and failing to educate the client on best practices. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the ethical and regulatory implications of a client's request. This involves a thorough understanding of relevant laws, codes of conduct, and internal firm policies. The next step is to assess the potential harm to clients, the market, and the firm's reputation. Open and honest communication with the client, clearly explaining the risks and regulatory boundaries, is crucial. If the client remains insistent on a course of action that violates ethical or regulatory standards, the professional must be prepared to decline the business, documenting the reasons for this decision thoroughly. This process ensures that professional judgment is exercised responsibly, prioritizing integrity and compliance. Question 7. The analysis reveals that a firm is conducting an impact assessment on client data to identify trends and opportunities. The dataset contains a significant amount of personally identifiable information, PI, and the project timeline is aggressive, creating pressure to expedite the process. Which approach best balances the need for timely insights with the imperative of data privacy and regulatory compliance? Option A. Proceed with the analysis using the raw data and implement anonymization only after the final report is generated. Option B. Redact or anonymize all PII from the dataset before commencing the impact assessment analysis. Option C. Rely solely on existing internal access controls to restrict who can view the raw PII during the analysis. Option D. Conduct the analysis on a subset of the data that has been randomly selected and is believed to be less sensitive. The correct answer is B. Redact or anonymize all PII from the dataset before commencing the impact assessment analysis. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient data processing with the fundamental ethical and regulatory obligation to protect sensitive personal information. The firm is under pressure to deliver insights quickly, but any compromise on data privacy could lead to significant reputational damage, regulatory penalties, and loss of client trust. The core of the challenge lies in identifying and mitigating risks associated with handling personally identifiable information, PI, during an impact assessment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes data minimization and anonymization, which are core principles in data protection regulations. By redacting or anonymizing PII before analysis, the firm adheres to the spirit and letter of data privacy laws, ensuring that individuals' sensitive information is not unnecessarily exposed. This proactive measure demonstrates a commitment to ethical data handling and regulatory compliance, building a foundation of trust with clients and stakeholders. It aligns with the principle of privacy by design, embedding data protection into the assessment process from the outset. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the analysis without any form of PII redaction or anonymization represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This directly contravenes data protection principles that mandate the protection of personal data. Such an approach risks unauthorized access, disclosure, or misuse of PII, leading to potential breaches of confidentiality and violations of privacy laws. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for individuals' right to privacy and could result in severe consequences, including fines and legal action. Another incorrect approach, which involves anonymizing data only after the analysis is complete, is also professionally unacceptable. While it attempts to address privacy concerns, it creates a window of vulnerability where PII is exposed during the initial stages of the assessment. This delay in implementing protective measures increases the risk of accidental disclosure or unauthorized access to sensitive data before it is anonymized. Best practice dictates that protective measures should be in place from the earliest possible stage of data handling. A further incorrect approach, such as relying solely on internal access controls without any data anonymization or redaction, fails to adequately protect PII. Internal access controls, while important, are not foolproof and do not eliminate the inherent risk associated with processing raw PII. Regulatory frameworks often require more robust measures, such as anonymization or pseudonymization, to reduce the likelihood of re-identification and protect data, even in the event of an internal security lapse. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment at the outset of any data-intensive project. This assessment should identify all types of data being handled, with a particular focus on PII. Subsequently, appropriate data protection measures, such as anonymization, pseudonymization, or redaction, should be implemented based on the sensitivity of the data and the requirements of applicable regulations. Continuous monitoring and review of these measures throughout the project lifecycle are also crucial to ensure ongoing compliance and data security. Question 8. System analysis indicates a client who has previously expressed a strong aversion to any investment involving companies with significant environmental impact is now requesting a portfolio allocation that heavily favors fossil fuel companies, citing a recent short-term market trend. The professional has a duty to ensure all advice is suitable and in the client's best interest, and is aware that this request contradicts the client's stated long-term values and risk tolerance. What is the most appropriate course of action for the professional? Option A. Proceed with the requested allocation, but omit any discussion of the environmental impact or the contradiction with the client's previously stated values, focusing solely on the short-term market trend. Option B. Advise the client that their request is ill-advised and refuse to implement it, stating that the professional will only proceed with investments aligned with their original stated values. Option C. Immediately execute the client's requested portfolio allocation, as client instructions are paramount and must be followed without question. Option D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the reasons behind this sudden shift in preference. Clearly explain the potential conflicts with their stated values and risk profile. Outline the risks and benefits of such an allocation, and present alternative strategies that align with their original objectives. The correct answer is D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the reasons behind this sudden shift in preference. Clearly explain the potential conflicts with their stated values and risk profile. Outline the risks and benefits of such an allocation, and present alternative strategies that align with their original objectives. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the potential for that preference to lead to suboptimal outcomes or even regulatory breaches. The professional is tasked with balancing client autonomy with their fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest and adhere to regulatory requirements. The difficulty lies in discerning when a client's instruction is merely a preference versus a directive that, if followed, would violate professional standards or legal obligations. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for misinterpretation, the impact on the client's financial well-being, and the professional's own liability. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation into the client's underlying motivations and a clear explanation of the risks and benefits associated with their preferred course of action, alongside alternative, more suitable options. This aligns with the principles of informed consent and best interest duties mandated by regulatory frameworks such as the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) Handbook, specifically in areas like COB's Conduct of Business Sourcebook, which emphasizes treating customers fairly and ensuring suitability of advice. By engaging in this dialogue, the professional upholds their duty to provide suitable advice, educates the client, and documents the decision-making process, thereby mitigating risks for both parties. This approach prioritizes client understanding and well-being while ensuring compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately implement the client's instruction without further inquiry. This fails to meet the professional's duty of care and suitability obligations. It could lead to a breach of regulations requiring advice to be appropriate to the client's circumstances and objectives. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's preference outright without understanding the rationale behind it. This can alienate the client and may overlook valid, albeit perhaps unconventional, reasons for their request. It also fails to fulfill the professional's obligation to explore all reasonable options and explain them clearly. This can be seen as a failure to treat the customer fairly, a core FCA principle. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the client's preferred option while downplaying or omitting the associated risks. This is a serious ethical and regulatory failing. It constitutes misrepresentation and a breach of the duty to provide accurate and complete information, which is fundamental to client trust and regulatory compliance. Such an action could expose the professional to significant disciplinary action and legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's request and its underlying drivers. This should be followed by an assessment of the request against regulatory requirements and professional best practices. If the request appears problematic, the professional must engage in a transparent and informative dialogue with the client, explaining the implications and offering suitable alternatives. Documentation of this process is crucial for demonstrating due diligence and compliance. The ultimate goal is to achieve an outcome that is both aligned with the client's informed wishes and compliant with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 9. The control framework reveals a proposal to streamline the client assessment process by reducing the number of qualitative questions and introducing an automated scoring mechanism for certain sections. This optimization aims to significantly decrease assessment time and associated costs. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of process optimization within the People Answers assessment framework? Option A. Prioritize the automation aspect, rolling out the automated scoring first, and then considering the reduction in qualitative questions based on initial feedback. Option B. Implement the proposed changes immediately to realize cost savings, with a plan to review the impact on assessment outcomes after 6 months. Option C. Rely on the subjective feedback of the assessment team leaders who believe the changes will improve efficiency without formal data collection. Option D. Conduct a pilot program of the streamlined process with a representative sample of clients and assessors, collecting data on accuracy, fairness, and efficiency before full implementation. The correct answer is B. Implement the proposed changes immediately to realize cost savings, with a plan to review the impact on assessment outcomes after 6 months. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the efficiency gains of process optimization with the fundamental principles of fair and accurate client assessment, as mandated by the People Answers assessment framework. The core tension lies in identifying whether proposed changes genuinely improve the assessment process or inadvertently introduce bias or reduce its effectiveness. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any optimization does not compromise the integrity of the assessment outcomes, which are critical for regulatory compliance and client protection. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, data-driven evaluation of the proposed changes. This involves a pilot testing phase to gather empirical evidence on the impact of the optimization on assessment accuracy, fairness, and efficiency. It also necessitates seeking feedback from a diverse group of stakeholders, including assessors, and potentially a sample of individuals who have undergone the assessment. This multifaceted approach aligns with the regulatory expectation of ensuring that assessment tools and processes are robust, reliable, and free from undue bias. By validating the optimization through empirical data and stakeholder input, the firm demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement that is grounded in evidence and ethical considerations, thereby upholding the spirit and letter of the People Answers assessment guidelines. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without adequate validation would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Such an approach could lead to the implementation of a flawed process that disproportionately disadvantages certain individuals or yields inaccurate results, potentially violating principles of fairness and non-discrimination inherent in assessment regulations. Another incorrect approach, which relies on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a limited group of senior staff, fails to provide the objective, empirical basis required for significant process changes. This can lead to the adoption of optimizations that are not truly effective or may even be detrimental, undermining the credibility of the assessment process and potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny. A third incorrect approach, which prioritizes speed of implementation over thoroughness, risks overlooking critical flaws or unintended consequences, thereby failing to meet the professional standard of due diligence in process design and deployment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the objectives of the optimization. Second, identify potential risks and ethical considerations associated with the proposed changes. Third, design a robust evaluation plan that includes pilot testing and data collection. Fourth, gather diverse stakeholder feedback. Fifth, analyze the collected data and feedback to make an informed decision about implementation, modification, or rejection of the proposed optimization. Finally, ensure that any implemented changes are continuously monitored for effectiveness and compliance. Question 10. The performance metrics show a significant decline in output for a key team member over the last quarter, yet informal observations suggest the individual is highly engaged and contributing positively in team discussions and collaborative tasks. Option A. Dismiss the performance metrics as inaccurate and focus solely on the positive informal observations, assuming the metrics are flawed. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the performance metrics. Gather additional objective data, e.g., project completion rates, quality of work samples. Seek documented feedback from colleagues and supervisors, and consult with HR to understand any potential contributing factors before making any decisions. Option C. Address the employee directly, expressing personal disappointment based on the metrics, and suggest they try harder without providing specific guidance or seeking to understand the underlying causes. Option D. Initiate a formal performance improvement plan based solely on the negative metrics, without further investigation into the discrepancy. Correct answer is D. Initiate a formal performance improvement plan based solely on the negative metrics, without further investigation into the discrepancy. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in performance management where objective data, performance metrics, clashes with subjective observations and potential biases. The professional challenge lies in reconciling these differing perspectives to ensure fair, accurate, and compliant assessment. It requires careful judgment to avoid overlooking genuine performance issues or unfairly penalizing individuals due to personal biases or incomplete data. The risk of misinterpreting metrics or allowing personal feelings to influence decisions can lead to detrimental outcomes for both the employee and the organization, potentially impacting morale, productivity, and even leading to legal challenges if discriminatory practices are perceived. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted investigation that prioritizes objective evidence and adheres to established company policies and regulatory guidelines for performance assessment. This approach represents best professional practice because it ensures fairness, transparency, and accountability. By seeking corroborating evidence, reviewing documented feedback, and consulting with HR, the professional demonstrates a commitment to a thorough and unbiased evaluation. This aligns with principles of good governance and ethical conduct, ensuring that decisions are based on facts rather than assumptions or personal feelings. It also mitigates the risk of unfair dismissal or disciplinary action, which could have significant legal and reputational consequences. Adhering to HR policies and regulatory frameworks for employee assessment is paramount to avoid claims of unfair treatment or discrimination. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on the initial negative performance metrics without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge that metrics can sometimes be misleading or incomplete. It may overlook contextual factors influencing performance or fail to identify systemic issues that are not solely the employee's responsibility. This approach risks making a premature judgment, potentially leading to unfair disciplinary action and damaging employee morale. It also bypasses the due diligence required in performance management, which could be a regulatory or policy violation if a structured process for investigation is mandated. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the performance metrics entirely based on a positive personal relationship with the employee. This introduces personal bias into the assessment process, which is a significant ethical and professional failing. It undermines the integrity of the performance management system and can lead to a situation where genuine performance issues are not addressed, potentially impacting team productivity and the organization's overall objectives. From a regulatory standpoint, this could be seen as preferential treatment or a failure to uphold objective standards, especially if similar situations involving other employees are handled differently. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on anecdotal evidence of positive contributions without considering the documented performance metrics. While positive contributions are valuable, they do not negate the importance of objective performance data. This approach risks ignoring critical areas where the employee may be underperforming, which could have broader implications for the team or project. It also fails to address the discrepancy highlighted by the metrics, leaving a potential performance gap unaddressed and potentially violating internal policies that require addressing all aspects of performance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach performance assessment by first acknowledging all available data, both quantitative metrics and qualitative observations, feedback. The initial step should always be to investigate any discrepancies or concerning trends. This involves gathering more information, seeking clarification, and reviewing documented history. When performance metrics indicate a potential issue, the professional's responsibility is to conduct a thorough and objective review, consulting relevant policies and seeking guidance from HR or legal departments when necessary. This process ensures that decisions are fair, defensible, and aligned with regulatory and ethical standards. The goal is to foster improvement and address performance gaps constructively, rather than making hasty judgments based on incomplete information or personal biases. Question 11. Strategic planning requires a thorough evaluation of existing processes to identify areas for improvement. When considering optimizations for the people answers assessment, which of the following approaches best aligns with maintaining the integrity and effectiveness of the assessment while seeking efficiency gains? Option A. Implementing a phased rollout of revised assessment modules, informed by pilot testing with a representative user group and analysis of feedback on data quality and user experience. Option B. Adopting a new, unverified third-party assessment tool that promises faster data collection without conducting a comprehensive validation study. Option C. Immediately reducing the length of the assessment by removing a significant portion of questions deemed less critical, based on a quick review of their perceived importance. Option D. Making changes to the assessment structure based on informal discussions with a few experienced users who suggest certain questions are redundant. The correct answer is A. Implementing a phased rollout of revised assessment modules, informed by pilot testing with a representative user group and analysis of feedback on data quality and user experience. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficiency and cost reduction with the fundamental ethical and regulatory obligations to maintain the integrity and effectiveness of the people answers assessment process. The pressure to optimize can lead to shortcuts that compromise the quality of data collection or analysis, potentially impacting the validity of the assessment outcomes. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any process optimization does not inadvertently introduce bias, reduce the comprehensiveness of responses, or violate the principles of fair and accurate assessment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the systematic and evidence-based refinement of the assessment process. By focusing on user feedback and piloting changes, it adheres to the principle of continuous improvement, which is implicitly encouraged by regulatory frameworks that aim for fair and reliable assessments. This method ensures that any modifications are tested for their impact on data quality and user experience before full implementation, thereby safeguarding the integrity of the people answers assessment. This aligns with the ethical duty to conduct assessments competently and responsibly, ensuring that the outcomes are meaningful and trustworthy. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on reducing the number of questions, without considering the impact on data richness or validity, is professionally unacceptable. This could lead to a superficial assessment that fails to capture the nuances required for accurate evaluation, potentially violating the regulatory expectation of a comprehensive and reliable assessment. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing changes based on anecdotal evidence or assumptions, rather than empirical testing, risks introducing unintended biases or errors. This bypasses the due diligence required to ensure the assessment remains fair and accurate, which is a core regulatory and ethical concern. Relying on external, unverified tools without proper integration and validation also poses a significant risk, as it can compromise the data integrity and comparability of the assessment results, failing to meet the standards of a robust assessment process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the objectives of process optimization. This should be followed by a thorough analysis of the current process to identify specific areas for improvement. Any proposed changes must then be evaluated against the core principles of the people answers assessment, including its validity, reliability, fairness, and compliance with relevant guidelines. Piloting and testing are crucial steps to gather empirical data on the impact of proposed changes. Finally, Decisions should be made based on evidence, prioritizing approaches that enhance efficiency without compromising the quality and integrity of the assessment. Question 12. Risk assessment procedures indicate that the current people answers assessment process is taking longer than anticipated, potentially impacting resource allocation. Which approach to optimizing this process would best uphold the principles of fairness and validity in assessment? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the assessment's objectives and current methodology, gathering data on each stage's effectiveness and participant feedback for piloting targeted improvements. Option B. Implement a new, shorter assessment tool suggested by a single experienced assessor without further validation. Option C. Focus solely on streamlining administrative tasks associated with the assessment, assuming this will inherently improve the quality of the answers provided. Option D. Immediately reduce the time allocated for each assessment component based on the average time taken by the fastest individuals. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the assessment's objectives and current methodology, gathering data on each stage's effectiveness and participant feedback before piloting targeted improvements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficiency in a critical assessment process with the imperative to maintain the integrity and fairness of that process. The people answers assessment, by its nature, involves evaluating individuals, and any optimization must not compromise the validity of these evaluations or introduce bias. Careful judgment is required to ensure that process improvements do not inadvertently disadvantage certain individuals or groups or lead to superficial assessments. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, evidence-based review of the existing process before implementing changes. This aligns with regulatory expectations for fairness, accuracy, and due diligence in assessment procedures. By involving stakeholders and piloting changes, it ensures that the optimization is practical, effective, and does not negatively impact the quality of the assessment or the experience of those being assessed. This proactive and measured approach minimizes the risk of unintended consequences and demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement that is both responsible and compliant. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on reducing the time taken for each assessment without considering the impact on assessment quality or fairness is professionally unacceptable. This could lead to superficial evaluations, potentially missing critical information, or misinterpreting responses, which violates the ethical obligation to conduct thorough and accurate assessments. Such an approach might also inadvertently introduce bias if the time constraints disproportionately affect individuals who require more time to articulate their thoughts, or if the shortened process favors certain communication styles. This failure to consider the qualitative aspects of the assessment process and its potential impact on individuals constitutes a regulatory and ethical failure. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing changes based on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a few individuals, without systematic data collection or validation, is also professionally unsound. This lacks the rigor expected in assessment design and implementation. It risks introducing changes that are not genuinely beneficial or, worse, are detrimental to the assessment's purpose. This approach fails to meet the standard of evidence-based practice and could lead to assessments that are not fit for purpose, potentially violating regulations that mandate the use of validated and reliable assessment methods. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the current process. Clearly define the existing steps, objectives, and outcomes. 2. Identify areas for improvement. Based on data, feedback, and risk assessment, pinpoint specific aspects that could be optimized. 3. Develop potential solutions. Brainstorm and design changes that address the identified areas. 4. Evaluate potential impacts. Critically assess how proposed changes might affect assessment quality, fairness, validity, and the experience of participants. Consider potential biases. 5. Pilot and test. Implement changes on a small scale to gather data and feedback before full rollout. 6. Monitor and refine. Continuously track the performance of the optimized process and make further adjustments as needed. 7. Document all changes and justifications. Maintain clear records of the process optimization journey. Question 13. Quality control measures reveal a pattern of inconsistent scoring across different assessors for the people answers assessment, despite assessors reporting they followed the provided guidelines. What is the most appropriate next step to address this discrepancy? Option A. Acknowledge the findings but consider them minor deviations that do not warrant significant procedural changes at this time. Option B. Increase the number of assessments conducted to average out any individual scoring variations. Option C. Immediately revise the assessment questions to introduce new elements that may inherently lead to more objective responses. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of assessor training materials and conduct a calibration session to ensure consistent interpretation and application of scoring criteria. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of assessor training materials and conduct a calibration session to ensure consistent interpretation and application of scoring criteria. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing the need for efficiency in the people-answers assessment process with the imperative to maintain the integrity and accuracy of the assessment outcomes. The quality control findings indicate a potential systemic issue that could lead to biased or inaccurate evaluations, impacting both the individuals being assessed and the firm's ability to make sound decisions based on those assessments. The professional challenge lies in identifying the root cause of the observed inconsistencies and implementing a solution that is both effective and compliant with regulatory expectations for fair and objective assessment practices. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on a systematic review of the assessment methodology, including the training provided to assessors and the calibration of assessment tools. This aligns with best professional practice by addressing the potential for human error or bias at multiple points in the assessment lifecycle. It demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement and adherence to principles of fairness and objectivity, which are often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory frameworks governing employee assessments and professional development. By investigating assessor training and tool calibration, the firm is proactively seeking to ensure that the assessment process is applied consistently and reliably, thereby upholding the validity of the results. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately revising the assessment questions without first understanding why the quality control measures flagged inconsistencies. This is a reactive measure that fails to address the potential underlying issues, such as assessor interpretation or bias, which could persist even with new questions. This approach risks creating a superficial fix that does not resolve the core problem and could lead to further inefficiencies or inaccurate assessments. It may also violate principles of due process if individuals are reassessed based on a flawed premise. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the quality control findings as minor anomalies without further investigation. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for potential systemic weaknesses. Regulatory bodies often expect firms to have robust quality assurance processes in place and to act upon identified issues. Ignoring such findings could be seen as a failure to maintain adequate controls, potentially leading to reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny if the issues result in unfair outcomes. A third incorrect approach is to solely focus on increasing the volume of assessments to dilute the impact of any individual inconsistencies. This prioritizes throughput over accuracy and fairness. It fails to address the root cause of the quality control issues and could exacerbate them by placing further strain on an already potentially flawed process. This approach is ethically questionable as it prioritizes business objectives over the integrity of the assessment process and the fair treatment of individuals. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should adopt a structured problem-solving approach. First, thoroughly investigate the quality control findings to understand the nature and extent of the inconsistencies. Second, identify potential root causes, considering factors such as assessor training, assessment tool design, and the assessment environment. Third, develop and implement targeted solutions that address these root causes, prioritizing approaches that enhance objectivity and consistency. Fourth, monitor the effectiveness of implemented solutions through ongoing quality control and feedback mechanisms. This systematic and evidence-based approach ensures that decisions are well-informed, compliant with professional standards, and ultimately lead to a more robust and reliable assessment process. Question 14. Quality control measures reveal that the current client assessment process is time-consuming, leading to potential delays in onboarding and advisory services. To address this, what is the most appropriate approach to optimize the process while ensuring continued regulatory compliance and client suitability? Option A. Implement a structured review of the assessment questionnaire to identify and refine questions that are redundant or can be answered more efficiently through technology, while also introducing a mandatory human review of all automated data analysis for critical suitability factors. Option B. Significantly reduce the number of questions asked during client interviews to expedite the process. Option C. Delegate the entire client assessment process to junior staff with minimal oversight to increase throughput. Option D. Rely solely on automated algorithms to interpret all client responses and determine suitability without any human oversight. The correct answer is A. Implement a structured review of the assessment questionnaire to identify and refine questions that are redundant or can be answered more efficiently through technology, while also introducing a mandatory human review of all automated data analysis for critical suitability factors. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficiency in a client assessment process with the fundamental regulatory and ethical obligation to ensure the accuracy and completeness of information gathered. The pressure to streamline can lead to shortcuts that compromise the integrity of the assessment, potentially resulting in misinformed advice or regulatory breaches. The challenge lies in identifying and implementing improvements that enhance efficiency without sacrificing the quality and depth of client understanding. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on refining the existing assessment framework by introducing targeted improvements to data collection and analysis. This involves leveraging technology for more efficient data input and utilizing structured feedback mechanisms to identify and address specific areas of weakness in the current process. This aligns with regulatory expectations for robust client due diligence and suitability assessments, ensuring that all relevant information is captured and considered. It represents best professional practice by demonstrating a commitment to continuous improvement and adherence to regulatory standards for client assessment, thereby safeguarding both the client's interests and the firm's compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves significantly reducing the number of questions asked during client interviews. This is a direct violation of regulatory requirements for thorough client assessment. It risks omitting crucial information necessary to determine suitability for products or services, leading to potential breaches of conduct rules and fiduciary duties. Such a shortcut prioritizes speed over accuracy, exposing the firm to significant compliance and reputational risks. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on automated algorithms to interpret client responses without human oversight. While automation can aid efficiency, regulatory frameworks often mandate professional judgment and human intervention in assessing client needs and risks. Over-reliance on algorithms can lead to misinterpretations, overlooking nuances in client communication, or failing to identify subtle indicators of risk or suitability, thus failing to meet the standard of care expected. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the entire assessment process to junior staff without adequate training or supervision. This fails to acknowledge the complexity and importance of client assessments, which require experienced judgment and a deep understanding of regulatory obligations. It increases the likelihood of errors, omissions, and noncompliance, as junior staff may lack the expertise to identify critical information or navigate complex regulatory nuances. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach process optimization by first identifying specific pain points or inefficiencies within the existing framework. This involves a thorough review of the current assessment steps, considering feedback from staff and, where appropriate, clients. The next step is to brainstorm potential solutions that enhance efficiency while upholding regulatory and ethical standards. This often involves a combination of technological solution, process redesign, and enhanced training. Critically, any proposed changes must be evaluated against regulatory requirements for client assessment, suitability, and data integrity. A phased implementation with pilot testing and ongoing monitoring is advisable to ensure effectiveness and compliance. The decision-making process should prioritize client best interests and regulatory adherence above all else. Question 15. System analysis indicates that a client, experiencing significant market volatility and personal anxiety, is urgently requesting to liquidate all their investments and move to cash. As a financial advisor operating under UK regulations and SISI guidelines, what is the most appropriate initial response to this client's request? Option A. suggest a minor, immediate portfolio rebalancing to a slightly more conservative allocation without a full review to offer a sense of action. Option B, immediately proceed with liquidating all investments as requested to alleviate the client's immediate anxiety and demonstrate responsiveness. Option C, advise the client that market volatility is normal and they should not act impulsively, insisting they maintain their current investment strategy without further discussion. Option D, schedule a meeting to discuss the client's concerns in detail, review their financial goals, risk tolerance, and the potential implications of liquidation before recommending any course of action. The correct answer is D. Schedule a meeting to discuss the client's concerns in detail, review their financial goals, risk tolerance, and the potential implications of liquidation before recommending any course of action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate needs of a client with the long-term implications of their financial decisions and the firm's regulatory obligations. The client's emotional state and desire for quick action can create pressure to deviate from sound advice and established procedures. The advisor must navigate potential conflicts between client satisfaction and fiduciary duty, ensuring that advice is not unduly influenced by the client's immediate emotional response or the advisor's desire to retain business. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough, objective assessment of the client's situation and goals, aligning with the principles of suitability and client best interest mandated by regulatory frameworks such as the FCA's Conduct of Business Sourcebook, COBS, and the SISI Code of Conduct. This involves understanding the client's risk tolerance, financial capacity, and objectives before recommending any course of action. It also necessitates clear communication of risks and benefits, ensuring the client makes an informed decision. This approach upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty and promotes long-term client trust, which is a cornerstone of professional practice. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately agreeing to the client's request to liquidate all investments without further assessment. This fails to meet the suitability requirements, as it bypasses the crucial step of understanding the client's underlying reasons and the potential negative consequences of such a drastic action, such as incurring significant capital gains tax or missing out on potential market recovery. This could be a breach of COBS 9, information about clients, their knowledge and experience, financial situation, and the nature and extent of the service, and the SISI ethical principles regarding competence and diligence. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's concerns outright and insist on maintaining the current investment strategy without acknowledging their distress. This demonstrates a lack of empathy and a failure to engage with the client's stated needs, potentially violating the SISI ethical principle of acting with integrity and in the client's best interests. It also neglects the regulatory expectation to understand the client's evolving circumstances and risk perception. A third incorrect approach would be to offer a quick, superficial solution that appears to address the client's immediate anxiety, but does not involve a comprehensive review of their financial plan. This could involve suggesting a minor portfolio adjustment without considering the broader impact on their long-term objectives, thereby failing to provide holistic and suitable advice as expected under regulatory guidelines. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with active listening and empathy to understand the client's concerns. This should be followed by a comprehensive fact-finding process to gather all relevant information about their financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. Next, the professional must analyze this information objectively, considering various options and their implications. Finally, clear, transparent communication of recommendations, including potential risks and benefits, is essential to enable the client to make an informed decision. This process ensures that advice is suitable, compliant, and aligned with the client's best interests. Question 16. Comparative studies suggest that financial advisory firms often face internal pressures to promote proprietary products due to their higher revenue potential. In a scenario where a client's financial goals and risk profile could be met by both a proprietary product and a comparable external product, what is the most ethically and regulatorily sound approach for the financial advisor? Option A. Present both proprietary and external options, but subtly emphasize the advantages of the proprietary product through selective highlighting of its features and benefits. Option B. Disclose the firm's preference for proprietary products and then recommend the proprietary product, assuming it is good enough for the client's needs. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive, unbiased analysis of all suitable investment options, including both proprietary and external products, and recommend the option that demonstrably best meets the client's specific needs and objectives, irrespective of internal profitability. Option D. Prioritize the recommendation of the proprietary product, as it aligns with the firm's revenue goals, while providing a general disclosure that the firm offers other products. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive, unbiased analysis of all suitable investment options, including both proprietary and external products, and recommend the option that demonstrably best meets the client's specific needs and objectives, irrespective of internal profitability. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's commercial interests and its duty to provide objective, client-centric advice. The firm's desire to promote its proprietary products, which offer higher revenue, directly clashes with the fiduciary responsibility to recommend the most suitable options for the client, irrespective of internal profitability. Navigating this requires a robust understanding of regulatory expectations regarding client best interests and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. Correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's financial well-being and objectives above the firm's revenue generation. This aligns with the core principles of fiduciary duty and the regulatory framework's emphasis on acting in the client's best interests. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit and letter of regulations that mandate suitability, transparency, and the disclosure of any potential conflicts. By conducting a thorough, unbiased assessment of all available options, including those outside the firm's proprietary offerings, the professional demonstrates integrity and upholds the trust placed in them by the client. This approach fosters long-term client relationships built on a foundation of objective advice and demonstrable client benefit. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on promoting proprietary products, even if they are good, fails to meet the regulatory standard of acting in the client's best interests. This is because it inherently introduces a conflict of interest, where the firm's profit motive may override the client's optimal outcome. Such an approach risks violating regulations that require a comprehensive assessment of suitability and may lead to accusations of mis-selling or a breach of fiduciary duty. Another incorrect approach that involves disclosing the conflict but still heavily favoring proprietary products without a clear and compelling justification based on superior client benefit is also professionally unacceptable. Disclosure is a component of managing conflicts. It does not absolve the professional from the primary obligation to act in the client's best interests. If the disclosure is merely a formality and the advice remains biased, the regulatory and ethical breaches persist. A further incorrect approach that might involve subtly downplaying the benefits of non-proprietary options while highlighting the advantages of proprietary ones, even without explicit misrepresentation, is ethically dubious and potentially breaches regulatory requirements for transparency and fair dealing. This manipulative tactic undermines the client's ability to make an informed decision and erodes trust. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear hierarchy of duties. First, the client's best interests. Second, adherence to regulatory requirements. And third, the firm's commercial objectives. Professionals should always start by identifying the client's specific needs, risk tolerance, and financial goals. Then, they must conduct an objective evaluation of all suitable investment options, including those that may not be profitable for the firm. Any potential conflicts of interest must be identified, disclosed transparently, and managed in a way that ensures the client's interests remain paramount. If a proprietary product is genuinely the best option for the client, this must be demonstrably proven through objective analysis, not assumed. Question 17. Assessment of the suitability of a new investment product for a broad client base, when the product has been heavily promoted internally with aggressive sales targets, requires a professional to balance internal commercial pressures with their duty to act in the client's best interests. Which approach best demonstrates adherence to regulatory expectations and ethical conduct? Option A. Relying on the product development team's internal assessment of suitability and presenting the product to clients with minimal independent verification, as the internal team is presumed to have acted in good faith. Option B. Conducting a comprehensive, independent assessment of the product's features, risks, and potential benefits, comparing it against the diverse needs, risk appetites, and financial goals of different client segments, and only recommending it where a clear and demonstrable fit exists. Option C, focusing the assessment on the product's potential for high returns, downplaying any associated risks or complexities to encourage client uptake and achieve sales objectives. Option D, prioritizing the recommendation of the new product to as many clients as possible to meet the firm's sales targets, while providing a general overview of its benefits and assuming clients will understand the associated risks. The correct answer is B, conducting a comprehensive, independent assessment of the product's features, risks, and potential benefits, comparing it against the diverse needs, risk appetites, and financial goals of different client segments, and only recommending it where a clear and demonstrable fit exists. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's commercial interests and its duty to provide objective, client-centric advice. The firm's management is prioritizing revenue generation from a specific product, potentially influencing the assessment of its suitability for clients. This creates a risk of mis-selling or recommending products that are not in the best interests of the client, thereby undermining trust and potentially breaching regulatory obligations. Careful judgment is required to navigate this pressure and ensure that client needs remain paramount. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's best interests and adheres to the fundamental principles of conduct expected by the regulator. This involves conducting a thorough, unbiased assessment of the product's suitability based on the client's individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and financial objectives. This aligns with regulatory requirements that mandate firms to act honestly, fairly, and professionally in accordance with the best interests of their clients. It also upholds ethical standards by ensuring transparency and avoiding any undue influence from internal commercial targets. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on meeting internal sales targets without adequate consideration of client suitability fails to uphold the firm's duty of care. This could lead to regulatory breaches related to suitability rules, misrepresentation, and potentially treating customers unfairly. Ethically, it represents a conflict of interest where the firm's profit motive overrides its fiduciary responsibility to the client. Another incorrect approach that involves downplaying potential risks or limitations of the product to secure a sale is a direct violation of disclosure obligations. Regulators expect full and fair disclosure of all material information, including risks, to enable clients to make informed decisions. Failure to do so can result in significant penalties and reputational damage. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's regulatory obligations and ethical duties. Professionals must first identify potential conflicts of interest, such as internal sales pressures. They should then critically evaluate the product's suitability against the client's specific profile, using objective criteria. If there is a conflict, the professional must escalate concerns internally or seek guidance to ensure that client interests are not compromised. Maintaining detailed records of the assessment process and the rationale for recommendations is crucial for demonstrating compliance and accountability. Question 18. When evaluating the feedback from a key stakeholder who is expressing dissatisfaction with the preliminary results of a people answers assessment, and this stakeholder is suggesting modifications to the interpretation to align with their pre-existing expectations, what is the most appropriate professional course of action? Option A. Agree to adjust the interpretation of the assessment results to better align with the stakeholder's expectations, emphasizing the importance of client satisfaction and the stakeholder's significant influence. Option B. Reiterate the established methodology and limitations of the people answers assessment, explaining that the interpretation must remain objective and aligned with the assessment's design, while offering to discuss the findings in detail and explore any potential misunderstandings. Option C. Inform the stakeholder that the assessment results are subjective and can be molded to fit various perspectives, suggesting that a revised interpretation can be provided to meet their needs. Option D. Politely dismiss the stakeholder's concerns, stating that the assessment results are final and cannot be altered, without offering further explanation or discussion. The correct answer is B. Reiterate the established methodology and limitations of the people answers assessment, explaining that the interpretation must remain objective and aligned with the assessment's design, while offering to discuss the findings in detail and explore any potential misunderstandings. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate needs and expectations of a key stakeholder with the long-term integrity of the assessment process and the regulatory requirements governing it. The pressure to deliver a positive outcome for a significant client can create a temptation to deviate from established procedures. Careful judgment is required to uphold professional standards while managing stakeholder relationships. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the people, answers assessments, established methodology, and regulatory framework. This ensures fairness, consistency, and validity in the assessment outcomes, which are fundamental to the credibility of the assessment process and the organization administering it. By clearly communicating the assessment's limitations and the rationale behind its design, the professional demonstrates transparency and ethical conduct, aligning with the principles of responsible assessment practice. This upholds the integrity of the data and prevents potential misinterpretations or misuse of assessment results, which could have regulatory implications if the assessment is used for compliance or decision-making purposes. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on meeting the stakeholders' desired outcome without regard for the assessment's methodology would fail to uphold the validity and reliability of the people answers assessment. This could lead to biased results, misinformed decisions, and a breach of the regulatory framework that mandates fair and accurate assessment. For instance, attempting to adjust results to fit a predetermined narrative would constitute a serious ethical lapse, potentially leading to regulatory sanctions if the assessment is used in a regulated context. Another incorrect approach, such as withholding information about the assessment's limitations to avoid disappointing the stakeholder, would be a failure of transparency and could mislead the stakeholder into making decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information, which is ethically unsound and potentially breaches disclosure requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the people answers assessment's purpose, methodology, and governing regulations. When faced with stakeholder pressure, the first step is to acknowledge the stakeholder's perspective and concerns. Subsequently, the professional must clearly articulate the assessment's established protocols and the reasons behind them, emphasizing the importance of maintaining objectivity and validity. If the stakeholder's request genuinely highlights a potential improvement or a misunderstanding of the assessment scope, the professional should explore these points within the established framework, rather than compromising it. Escalation to a supervisor or relevant compliance officer should be considered if the pressure to deviate becomes significant or if there is a risk of non-compliance. Question 19. Operational review demonstrates that a regulatory body has requested specific client data related to a recent market event. The firm's compliance department has flagged the request as potentially sensitive due to client confidentiality agreements and data privacy regulations. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm to take in responding to this request? Option A. Immediately compile and submit all requested client data to the regulatory body to ensure full cooperation and avoid any perception of obstruction. Option B. Inform the regulatory body that client confidentiality agreements prevent the disclosure of any information and refuse to provide any data. Option C. Selectively provide data that appears most relevant to the market event, without a formal process for verification or legal review. To expedite the response, Option D. Engage with the regulatory body to clarify the exact nature and scope of the data required, and to establish a secure and compliant method for data transfer that respects client confidentiality and relevant data protection laws. The correct answer is A. Immediately compile and submit all requested client data to the regulatory body to ensure full cooperation and avoid any perception of obstruction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the ethical and regulatory obligations to protect client confidentiality and data privacy. The firm's reputation and legal standing are at risk if client data is mishandled or if internal processes are not robust enough to prevent unauthorized access. The pressure to respond quickly to a regulatory inquiry can lead to shortcuts that compromise these fundamental principles. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a structured, compliant, and ethical response. It acknowledges the regulatory inquiry and the need for information, but mandates that all data retrieval and disclosure must adhere strictly to internal policies, data protection laws, and client agreements. This approach ensures that client confidentiality is maintained, data is handled securely, and the firm acts transparently and cooperatively with the regulator, thereby mitigating legal and reputational risks. It reflects a commitment to due diligence and responsible data stewardship. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that involves immediately providing all requested client data without verification or adherence to internal protocols, fails to uphold client confidentiality and data privacy regulations. This could lead to breaches of contract with clients and violations of data protection laws, resulting in significant fines and legal action. It also bypasses necessary internal checks and balances, increasing the risk of errors or the disclosure of sensitive, irrelevant information. An approach that delays or refuses to cooperate with the regulatory inquiry, citing only general confidentiality concerns without a clear legal basis or a proposed alternative method of cooperation, is professionally unacceptable. This can be interpreted as obstruction, leading to regulatory sanctions, increased scrutiny, and potential damage to the firm's relationship with the regulator. It fails to demonstrate good faith and a commitment to regulatory compliance. An approach that involves selectively providing information based on convenience or perceived importance, without a clear, documented process or legal justification, is also problematic. This can lead to accusations of bias or an incomplete picture being presented to the regulator, potentially resulting in further investigation or penalties. It undermines the principle of transparency and fairness in regulatory interactions. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should first understand the scope and legal basis of the regulatory inquiry. They must then consult internal policies, relevant data protection law, and client agreements to determine the permissible scope of data disclosure. A clear communication channel should be established with the regulator to understand their specific needs and to propose a compliant method for data provision, such as anonymized data or data provided under strict confidentiality agreements. If there is any ambiguity, seeking legal counsel is paramount. The decision-making process should be documented at each step to ensure accountability and transparency. Question 20. Stakeholder feedback indicates a consistent perception among a significant client group that the recent assessment outcomes for their employees are unfairly stringent, leading to increased failure rates. The firm's internal review of the assessment methodology shows no statistical anomalies or deviations from established scoring rubrics. How should the firm best address this feedback while upholding its professional and regulatory obligations? Option A. Acknowledge the feedback but inform the client group that the assessment methodology is robust and has been internally validated, therefore no changes will be made. Option B. Implement a blanket policy to offer all individuals from the affected client group a supplementary assessment or reevaluation regardless of their initial performance. Option C. Immediately revise the scoring thresholds downwards for the affected client group to reduce the failure rate and demonstrate responsiveness to their concerns. Option D. Initiate a targeted review of the assessment content and administration process, specifically seeking to understand the client group's perspective on perceived difficulties, and explore potential areas for clearer guidance or minor adjustments to assessment materials that do not compromise the integrity or rigor of the evaluation. The correct answer is D. Initiate a targeted review of the assessment content and administration process, specifically seeking to understand the client group's perspective on perceived difficulties, and explore potential areas for clearer guidance or minor adjustments to assessment materials that do not compromise the integrity or rigor of the evaluation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate needs and perceptions of a key stakeholder group with the long-term strategic objectives and regulatory compliance of the organization. The firm must demonstrate responsiveness to feedback without compromising its ethical obligations or the integrity of its assessment processes. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based review of the feedback. This aligns with regulatory expectations for fair and consistent assessment practices, as well as ethical duties to ensure that assessment outcomes are objective and defensible. By engaging with the stakeholder group to understand the root cause of their concerns, and then implementing targeted improvements based on data, the firm upholds its commitment to quality and fairness, thereby building trust and ensuring continued compliance with relevant assessment regulations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate appeasement without investigation risks undermining the credibility of the assessment process. This could lead to regulatory scrutiny for failing to maintain objective and consistent standards, potentially violating principles of fairness and due process in assessments. Another incorrect approach, which dismisses the feedback without proper consideration, demonstrates a lack of professional diligence and could result in a failure to identify and rectify systemic issues, leading to ongoing dissatisfaction and potential breaches of regulatory requirements related to stakeholder engagement and service quality. A third incorrect approach, which involves making arbitrary changes to assessment criteria, directly contravenes the need for objective and consistent evaluation, risking regulatory noncompliance and ethical breaches by introducing bias or subjectivity into the assessment process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with acknowledging and documenting all stakeholder feedback. This should be followed by a thorough analysis to identify the specific nature and scope of the concerns. Based on this analysis, a plan for investigation and potential remediation should be developed, ensuring that any proposed changes are evidence-based and aligned with regulatory requirements and ethical principles. Continuous monitoring and evaluation of the assessment process and stakeholder satisfaction are crucial to maintaining best practice.